The Honourable Member Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an honor to rise this afternoon to speak to Bill C-226, an act respecting the development of a national strategy to assess, prevent, and address environmental racism and to advance environmental justice, put forward by my colleague, the MP for Saanich Gulf Islands. It's far past time we address environmental racism. The disproportionate siting of polluting industries in Black communities, indigenous and racialized communities, and those of the working poor. These are communities that typically lack an economic and political base to fight back. It's impossible to ignore the reality that governments have consistently put harmful industries and dump sites dangerously close to the places in some of the most marginalized communities across the country. This is a systemic issue that not only negatively impacts those residents' physical health and wellness through abnormal incidences of cancers, of other diseases, but also discourages others from moving into that area, deterring growth and new opportunities for those within it. These decisions also impact the environment around those who live there, affecting drinking water and food sources for Indigenous communities in particular. All of this has a negative impact on the mental health of these residents, compounded by gas lighting, with the onus routinely placed on those impacted most to prove the situation is leading to these adverse effects and that change is required. I'd like to share a few examples. Africville, a Black community in Nova Scotia established in the 1850s on the outskirts of Halifax. The community was pushed to the margins and didn't receive the same services or infrastructure as others in the nearby city. Over the decades, undesirable developments were built in or near the community, including an infectious disease hospital, a dump, and a prison. Africville's water and land was contaminated, and eventually the city relocated residents in 1964 without meaningful consultation or compensation. Another is the toxic dumping in Kanesatake, Quebec, a community that is suffering ongoing health impacts of the toxic waste from a recycling facility, which has not been cleaned up despite repeated calls. Or we can take an example of a pipe at a pulp mill when it ruptures, spilling untreated effluent into a Pictou Landing First Nation wetland, and it takes 6 years to solve the issue. Or closer to my community in Ontario, the mercury poisoning crisis in Grassy Narrows First Nation and neighboring White Dog Independent Nations, one of Canada's worst environmental disasters that is still ongoing. From a recent CBC investigation, they found that 90% of the population of Grassy Narrows experiences symptoms of mercury poisoning, which includes neurological problems, seizures, and cognitive delays. Many homes don't have safe drinking water in an area with very limited health services and no on-reserve mental health care. The community has been fighting to have this contamination cleaned up for over 50 years without result. These are just a few of the many examples of how Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities have been disproportionately impacted by neglect and the siting of environmentally harmful industries. We can also see environmental racism and injustice showing up in other ways, like when racialized neighborhoods don't have the same access to green spaces, public trails and playgrounds, or even street trees in their area. Personally, I've learned so much on this topic from the incredible work of Dr. Ingrid Waldron and the Enrich Project, a collaborative community-based project investigating the cause and effect of toxic industries situated near Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian communities. It's a project that Dr. Waldron started and has led since 2012. Dr. Waldron literally wrote the book on environmental racism. It's called There's Something in the Water, which was then turned into a 2019 documentary of the same name, co-produced with Elliot Page and Julia Sanderson. Dr. Waldron says it best. In Canada, your postal code determines your health. In her words, she goes on to say, environmental racism is about a pattern, and it's historical. It's rooted and embedded in historical inequities, and it's about the lack of response by government to act on the siting of these industries in communities of color and indigenous communities. Dr. Waldron goes on to lay out two ways we can meaningfully address environmental racism. One is to develop legislation across the country, and the second is to provide education on the subject in schools. We collectively, as parliamentarians in this House of Commons, can take action on the first, and in Canada, we need to be honest, we are way behind. As an example, in the United States, the Office of Environmental Justice was formed as part of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1992. That's, 28 some odd years ago. Now, Dr. Waldron and others have been making incredible progress over the last number of years. Dr. Waldron worked with then MLA Lenore Zann on what was Bill 111, an Environmental Racism Protection Act, as part of the Nova Scotian legislature back in 2015, which was defeated at second reading. When elected as an MP representing Cumberland Colchester, then MP Lenore Zann in the previous parliament brought forward Bill C-230, which forms the basis of this piece of legislation before the House today, recognizing that while 230 had widespread support, it died on the order paper when an election was called. It's part of why I'm so glad that my colleague, the MP for Saanich Gulf Islands, has now brought back Lenore's PMB, now as C-226. I'm also glad that as it's being brought back, all of the work already done to this point, it's already been to committee, for example, it's had amendments adopted, and the only difference between this current bill and the one that was before the previous parliament is that the amendments that had been proposed are now included in the specifics of the strategy that would be developed should this bill be passed. And so it has all of the benefit of the cross-party support that the previous version of this bill already had. And it's for this reason that I'm hopeful that C-226 will continue to have the widespread support across party lines, recognizing that there is nothing partisan about ensuring that we take immediate steps to address environmental racism and environmental justice in this country. And so it's my hope that parliamentarians from all parties will even choose to fast track this legislation, recognizing it's already been studied so that we can move it to the Senate as quickly as possible and ideally have it passed into law. Because in conclusion, we know that for decades, environmental racism has been neglected by all levels of government and to some extent, the environmental movement itself. We must take action now to ensure that no community suffers the same harms as Africville, Grassy Narrows, and so many others. It's far past time to develop a national strategy to redress the harms of environmental racism and lead us into a just climate future for all. Thank you.